Hello everyone, this is Dr. Urvashi Sabu from PGDV College, Delhi University, and today I shall take you towards the conclusion of our discussion on Alexander Pope's poem, An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. If you remember, in our previous lecture, we had discussed this poem from the beginning. We spoke of it as being divided into 7 unequal parts. I had discussed 4 of those 7 parts with you in the previous lecture, and today we shall continue from part 5 onwards. In part 5 of this poem, Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, which starts from line about 260 to around 304, Alexander Pope makes a connection between his superior intellectual abilities and his financial independence. He analyzes intellect as a means for earning money, giving his own self as an example. He did not bow or scrape for favors from the court or the aristocracy. And I quote, "I was not born for courts or great affairs. I pay my debts, believe, I say my prayers." Rather, Pope's work was appreciated and won numerous readers who purchased his books, enabling him to earn a living through his writing rather than through sycophancy or flattery. Particularly, his translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey proved to be bestsellers of his time. Pope also presents his belief that the money he earned attracted, unfortunately, fools to him. His satire is therefore directed at such people who have no sense or taste for good writing and who will approve or disapprove of a work only on its superficial merits. Pope insists that an honest man needn't fear Pope's satires, but fools and babbling blockheads must be ridiculed and satirized. We continue now to part 6 of the poem, which is from lines about 306 to 335. And here, Pope presents to us the satirical portrait of John Lord Hervey as Sporus. Given that the immediate occasion of this poem was the publication of Verses Addressed to the Imitator of Horace, a satire on Pope, written by Lord Hervey and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, Pope's most biting invective is reserved for this portrait. Sporus, as Lord Hervey is called in this poem, was actually historically the name of the boy used by the Roman king Nero for sexual gratification. Hence, this name given to Lord Hervey is meant as an insult. Pope targets in this portrait not only Hervey's literary pretensions, but also his obnoxious behavior and his sexual inclinations, thus making this portrait an example of Juvenalian invective, sharp, biting, and bitter. When Pope begins to speak about Sporus, Dr. Arbuthnot, his friend, interjects to say that the person in question is so insensitive and unintelligent that he is not going to understand that he is being ridiculed. I quote, "What? That thing of silk? That mere white curd of ass's milk? Satire or sense, alas, can Sporus feel? Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel?" And these are words that come from Dr. Arbuthnot. But Pope continues, speaking of Sporus as an insect, insignificant, irritating, and despicable. Sporus is, I quote, "a bug with gilded wings, the painted child of dirt that stinks and sings." Sporus is compared to Satan in the form of a serpent or a toad, tempting the mother of mankind, Eve. Pope calls Sporus both amphibious and androgynous, and I quote, "Fop at the toilet, flatterer at the board, now trips a lady, now struts a lord." In what is the only triplet in this poem of heroic couplets, that is from lines 323 to 325, Pope reviles Sporus in the following lines, and I quote, and you will notice that this particular stanza is a triplet and not the customary heroic couplet, that is a two-line stanza. Let us look at this triplet. His wit all seesaw between that and this. Now high, now low, now master up, now miss, and he himself one vile antithesis. So as we can see, the last words of the three lines, this, miss, and antithesis, and this becomes a triplet. It is the only triplet that exists in this poem of couplets. In this triplet, therefore, Pope effectively satirizes Sporus's wit as well as his sexual ambiguity. Sporus has the face of an angel but the body of a reptile, thus making him detestable and abhorrent, much like Satan. Pope thus extracts his revenge on Lord Harvey through this scathing satirical portrait. Pope had already criticized and satirized his friend-turned-enemy, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, as Sappho in his earlier poem, The Dunciad, which had been a biting satire on bad poetry and the poetasters of his time, as well as on those of his contemporaries who had abused him or his work. In this poem, too, Lady Montagu finds brief mention, once again, as Sappho. The reference to her is a reminder of the Dunciad, and Arbuthnot interjects to implore Pope not to take up the cudgels again. In the seventh and last part of the poem, from line 305 onwards till the end, Pope expects Arbuthnot to believe him when he says that he possesses certain qualities. And it is here that we get a self-portrait or a self-character sketch of Pope. Pope clarifies that he was neither proud nor servile. He neither ran after money nor after ambition. He is proud to have never used flattery to further his career. Pope states that he was unafraid of threats from his opponents and stood strong when his writings as well as his character were vilified. It is only when his detractors stooped to the level of vilifying his parents that Pope has chosen to get back at them. His enemies have abused his, and I quote, father, mother, body, soul, and muse. And this has caused him to finally pick up his pen and return these insults through satire. It is here in the seventh part that Pope talks affectionately and with pride of his parents, both his father and his mother, who were of gentle birth. Pope mentions his parents as unspotted names. Pope's father shed his blood for the glory of Britain and made his fortunes through his own efforts, not having been born into either money or nobility. Pope regards his father as a peace-loving, decent, honest, and wise man who was free from deceit. He lived a long and healthy life, and he died peacefully. Through this eulogy for his parents, Pope makes an effort to silence his detractors and critics, while simultaneously expressing pride in his simple lineage. He expresses a desire to live and die in the same blameless and peaceful manner as his father. He also reiterates his dutiful affection towards his mother, who lived with him at his estate in Twickenham until she passed away. Although she had died by the time this poem, An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, was published, Pope retains the lines about wanting to, within quotes, let the tender office long engage to rock the cradle of reposing age, and thus, I quote once again, keep a while one parent from the sky, as these would constitute a memory in verse of his love for his mother and the care he bestowed upon her in her last days. In the last three couplets of the poem, Pope expresses his good wishes for his friend and the listener or partner of this epistle, Dr. Arbuthnot. It is to be remembered that Dr. Arbuthnot himself was very ill when this poem was composed. As Pope mentions taking care of his mother in her last years, he is reminded of his friend Dr. Arbuthnot struggling with his own ill health. Thus, the last lines of the poem speak of the good wishes that Pope expresses for his friend and advisor. And I quote, "May heaven, to bless those days, preserve my friend. Preserve him social, cheerful, and serene, and just as rich as when he served a queen." End quote. These are references to the fact that Dr. Arbuthnot was a physician extraordinary to Queen Anne, the ruling monarch during Pope's time. And they also reflect his dignified status in society and prove further that Pope rightly chose him as the person to whom he would address this epistle. The poem ends with the words of Dr. Arbuthnot. I quote, "Whether that blessing be denied or given, thus far was right, the rest belongs to heaven." Let us look now at a critical appreciation of the poem by analyzing some of its features. We begin with the structure of the poem. As we've already discussed, the poem is divided roughly into 7 parts of unequal length. We've also discussed in the previous lecture that the poem begins in media res, or in the middle of a real life situation with dramatic dialogue. The poet asks his manservant to lock up his front door and to say he's sick or dead if anyone comes asking for him. We realize that Pope is fleeing from literary hacks and poetasters, and this makes for a perfect setting for the candid outburst from the poet. Although the poem is titled An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, we soon realize that it is not so much an epistle as a dramatic dialogue between Pope and Dr. Arbuthnot. In its first version, it had indeed been written as an epistle, but in the final version, there were interjections by Dr. Arbuthnot, and this made it now a dramatic monologue. We notice that the verses move freely and colloquially, and we are able to distinguish the totally divergent views of both the speakers, the poet's moral stance and the doctor's practical approach. A couplet that I'm going to quote now will give us an idea of the difference of their approaches. I quote, "A. Good friend, forbear, you deal in dangerous things. I'd never name queens, ministers, or kings. Keep close to ears and let those asses prick. 'Tis nothing. P. Nothing? If they bite and kick?" So we can see in this couplet that there is a conversation going on between Arbuthnot and Pope, where Arbuthnot is gently cautioning him to not be as open and candid as he is in his dislikes, while Pope, out of moral indignation, wishes to speak out in this poem. Pope makes very frequent use of the stylistic devices of enjambment, which means continuing the sense of the first line into the next. Let me quote a line for you. "I sit with sad civility. I read," and it continues into the next line, "with honest anguish and an aching head." If I read it non-stop, this is how this couplet will read. "I sit with sad civility. I read with honest anguish and an aching head." However, when we look at the poem, we notice that after the word "I read," the line changes and the sense continues into the next line. So this is how an enjambment is used. Let us look at another example. "Peace to all such, but were there one whose fires true genius kindles and fair fame inspires." And as you can see, "but were there one whose fires," and the line changes. It goes on to the next line. "True genius kindles and fair fame inspires." The sense is continued into the next line. This last quoted couplet is also an example of caesura, which means a pause in the middle, the beginning or the end of a line that is caused by natural speech rather than meter. Let me quote to you some more examples of caesura from this poem. Look at this couplet. Out with it, Dunciad! Exclamation mark. Let the secret pass. Next line. That secret to each fool that he's an ass. As we notice, out with it, Dunciad is one full sentence by itself. There is a pause there which is supplied by the exclamation mark. And then the couplet continues. Let the secret pass. That secret to each fool that he's an ass. Another example of caesura. Friend to my life! Exclamation. And then the rest of the couplet, which is followed by in parentheses, which did not you prolong, the world had wanted many an idle song. Let me read this couplet once again for you. Friend to my life, which did not you prolong, the world had wanted many an idle song. This is a unique couplet because not only is it an example of caesura, friend to my life, exclamation or pause, but it also is followed by an entire line in parenthesis or in brackets. So these are some of the very interesting stylistic devices that Pope uses in this poem. Pope also uses other forms of varied rhythm. For example, the triplet that we studied, lines 323 to 325, which have already been quoted earlier. The poet gradually but effectively builds a strong sense of conflict of values in every sphere, moral, literary, artistic, social, and economic. And in every case, the poet presents himself as different from the poets and the personages whom he ridicules or reviles. He sets himself up as totally different from these poets. The poem, as we've already seen, opens on a note of indignation and irritation as the poet is trying to escape from the swarm of poet tasters who pursue him for advice. He is heard asking his servant to lock up the entrance to his house as he seeks refuge from his pursuers. But as the poem continues, this righteous anger that the poet expresses gradually gives way to a sense of calm, to a positivity, and to a feeling of peace, brought about in no small measure by the timely and wise interjections of his listener and his friend, Dr. Arbuthnot. Thus, structurally, though the poem opens and closes in the poet's house, the emotional state of the poet changes from indignation to calm composure. Let us take a look now at the imagery of this poem. The predominant images in this poem are those of animals and insects. The poets who invade the Pope's privacy are spoken of as swarms and hounds. There is a reference to Sirius, the dog star, in line 3, and this brings to mind images not only of mad dogs but also of mad men. The image of an ass or a donkey is frequently used by Pope to describe the poet tasters who constantly trail him. Let me quote, "That secret to each fool that he's an ass." Or another quote, "Keep close to ears and those let asses prick." In yet another example, Sporus or Lord Hervey is described as, within quotes, "that mere white curd of ass's milk." Another animal image that is used frequently is that of a dog. Sporus is spoken of as a spaniel, which is a breed of dog. Pope refers to other poets who, like puppies, within quotes, "daggled through the town to fetch and carry sing-song up and down." Yet another image is that of the reptile. Sporus is compared to the serpent who tempted Eve, as also the toad who sat squat at Eve's ear. and Buffo, or the Earl of Halifax, is also portrayed as a toad. Insect imagery abounds in the poem, with Sporus being directly compared to a spider as well as a butterfly, thus both dangerous and inconsequential. Sporus is, within quotes, the bug with gilded wings, and also, within quotes, that painted child of dirt who stinks and stings. The poet taster is compared to a spider who does nothing but spin flimsy webs from his own excrement. It is to be remembered that both Pope's works, the Dunciad and the Satires, used extensive animal and insect imagery. In the verses addressed to the translator of Horace, which was the immediate occasion of the Epistle, Pope too had been compared to a wasp and a reptile. In the Epistle, Pope retaliates in the same vein, thus extracting his revenge. Let us look now at the Christian imagery in this poem. Pope presents himself and his parents as good Christians. He, within quotes, believes in a God and says his prayers, and, again within quotes, is free from religious strife. Unlike his predecessor, John Dryden, who changed his affiliations midlife from Protestantism to Catholicism, Pope remained a devout Catholic throughout his life, despite the difficulties of remaining so in the reign of Protestant monarchs. Pope professes to possess the Christian virtues of truth-telling, humility, as well as an aversion to wealth for wealth's sake. And thus, he presents an idealized version of his Christian self, while choosing to obfuscate the fact that he was extracting revenge, which is a Christian sin, or abusing his detractors and critics, another sin. Let us now continue and look at the economic motive that runs through the poem. We already know that Pope was one of the few writers of 18th century England who was able to make a living entirely from the money he earned with his writing. This finds mention at many places in the poem, where Pope consciously differentiates himself from those poets who have to seek patronage in order to fulfill their literary ambitions. And this patronage, as we've already seen, was usually sought through sycophancy and flattery, two qualities that Pope claims never to have required. Thus, Buffo, Atticus, and Sporus, the three personages in the poem, are all presented as patrons, but only for poet tasters. Also, these poet tasters, or literary hacks as we could call them, live in the abysmal conditions of hunger and poverty and squalor in Grub Street or Drury Lane in London, while Pope can afford to live in luxury because he has never had to prostitute his art for money. Let us look now at how Pope presents himself as a person in this poem. So let us analyze Pope's self-portrait in this poem. In this poem, Pope presents himself almost as a paragon of literary excellence as well as moral virtue. Pope's character sketch in this poem is an example of self-fashioning, that is, of creating a public image of oneself in accordance with all that is desirable in an age or time. Pope in this poem portrays himself as a well-read man of letters, a good writer, financially independent, morally superior, a worthy son, a caring friend, and a critic of mediocrity and of literary pretensions. The poem ends with a declaration of Pope's avowed poetic mission, which is the service of virtue in all aspects. And I quote, "Welcome for thee, fair virtue, all the past. For thee, fair virtue, welcome even the last." And with that, we come to an end of our discussion on Pope's poem, An Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. I do hope it will prove useful for all of you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.